When a man pulled a drowning German Shepherd puppy from a raging river, he never expected that saving the dog would lead to a journey of healing for both of them. What started as a rescue turned into a bond that changed their lives forever. This is a story of survival, trust, and the power of second chances, where love becomes the ultimate savior. If you're an animal lover, hit subscribe for more stories like this. It's completely free, and it inspires us to keep telling the ones that truly matter. Rick had never been the type to go looking for trouble, but that day, trouble found him. The sky was a blanket of gray, the kind of overcast day that made you want to crawl under a blanket and forget about the world. He'd spent most of his life trying to keep to himself, keeping his house in order and his mind clear. But there were days, rare days, when the weight of all his years would get too heavy to carry. This was one of those days. He'd just finished another long week of work, putting in long hours at the construction site, when the radio in his truck crackled with a dispatch. There was a call out near the river, a report of a dog in trouble. Rick didn't usually answer calls like these. He wasn't a hero, just a man doing his best to get by. But something about the urgency in the dispatcher's voice made him turn the wheel toward the riverbank. As he pulled up to the edge of the water, he could hear it, the sound of something small and desperate. A weak whine. The river was swollen from the recent rains, and the current was vicious. He couldn't see much, just the muddy churn of water crashing against the rocks. But there, in the middle of the river, was a shadow. A small, dark shape bobbing helplessly in the water. Without thinking, Rick threw his truck into park and rushed to the river's edge. His heart raced as he scanned the water. It wasn't just any dog. It was a puppy, a German Shepherd, barely big enough to be on his own. The poor thing was struggling to stay above the water, its tiny body trembling as it was pulled downstream by the current. Rick didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath, rolled up his sleeves, and waded in. The cold water hit him like a shock, biting into his skin, but he pressed on, moving through the muck and debris. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the puppy's soaking fur, just as the current threatened to pull it under. With a final, desperate lunge, Rick grabbed the puppy by the scruff of its neck and yanked it toward him. The moment the puppy was in his arms, it went completely still. Rick didn't have time to think. He just held the little dog close, shielding it from the biting cold, and waded back to shore. When they finally reached dry land, Rick collapsed on the bank, panting and drenched. The puppy was trembling violently in his arms, its eyes wide with fear. It didn't move, didn't bark. It just looked at him, its body shaking from both cold and terror. Rick didn't know what to do next. He wasn't a dog expert, wasn't even sure if the puppy would make it through the night. But something in the way it stared at him, so fragile, so trusting in that moment, made him vow to do whatever he could. "Hey, buddy," Rick whispered, his voice rough from the chill in the air. "You're safe now." The puppy didn't respond. It just lay there in his arms, its little chest heaving with shallow breaths. Rick felt his heart tighten. What had this puppy gone through to end up here, in this river, alone and cold? He didn't know, but he was going to find out. And somehow, he would make sure this little one never had to face anything like that again. He cradled the puppy against his chest and stood up, the weight of the tiny body grounding him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, Rick felt like he had a purpose. He was going to save this dog. He didn't know how, but he would figure it out. After all, it wasn't just a dog. It was a life. And it mattered. Rick's truck was still parked a few feet away, the engine running weakly. The puppy shivered in his arms, its tiny whimpers breaking the silence of the riverbank. Rick took a deep breath and turned back toward the truck. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. "Let's get you out of here." But as he walked back to the truck, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random act of fate. No, this felt different. Like there was more at play here than just a simple rescue. The puppy had chosen him somehow. Or maybe, just maybe, this was the universe giving him a chance to heal, to fix something broken inside him. Rick climbed into the truck, holding the puppy close. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: this dog was going to change his life. The next few days passed in a blur. Rick spent most of his time trying to get the little German Shepherd puppy back to some semblance of health. He wrapped the pup in blankets, gave him food, and tried to keep him warm as best as he could. But the puppy was distant, almost like he was waiting for something, waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for someone to take him away again. Rick didn't know much about dogs, but he could read their fear. And this puppy, he could see it in his eyes. Every time Rick came close, there was that hesitation, that instinct to pull away, to flinch. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. The puppy had been through something terrible, something that went beyond the drowning in the river. The first night Rick tried to sleep, the puppy didn't sleep at all. Instead, he lay under the workbench in the living room, wide-eyed, alert. Rick could hear the puppy's shallow breathing, his tiny body quivering in the darkness. He wanted to comfort him, but every time he reached out, the puppy pulled back, retreating further into the shadows. Rick couldn't get it out of his mind, how the puppy had almost drowned, how he had fought the current with everything he had, as though his life depended on it. Rick knew it did. But why? What was the story behind that fight for survival? The thought gnawed at him until he couldn't ignore it anymore. Rick knew that he needed answers. He needed to know what kind of life this dog had been living before he found him by the river. So, he did what he could do best. He called the vet. Kara was the local vet and someone Rick trusted. She had helped him through many animal rescues in the past, but this time felt different. He wasn't sure what he was asking, but he needed to understand. He needed to know if there was more to the puppy's fear than just the trauma of almost drowning. Kara, it's Rick, he started, his voice heavy. I've got a dog, a German shepherd, and I'm not sure what's going on with him. He's terrified, and I mean terrified. He won't let anyone near him, and it's like he's expecting something, waiting for something. Do you think you could take a look? Kara's voice on the other end was gentle, but Rick could hear the concern in it. Of course, Rick. But from what you're describing, it sounds like he might have been through something, more than just being abandoned. Let me check my schedule, and I'll see if I can fit him in tomorrow. Rick thanked her and hung up the phone, but the sense of dread he had been carrying only grew heavier. What if Kara couldn't help? What if this was something deeper than he could fix? He had already made a promise to the dog, one he wasn't sure he could keep. Still, he didn't know how to walk away. He had to try. The next morning, Rick loaded the puppy into the truck and made his way to the clinic. The ride was quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint whine of the dog in the back seat. He tried to talk to him, offer him some reassurance, but the puppy just lay there, curled up in the corner, his head low. At the clinic, Kara did a quick examination. The puppy's body was thin, but not dangerously so. He had no visible wounds, no obvious injuries. Still, Kara seemed concerned, especially when the puppy flinched every time she reached out to touch him. Rick, she said after a few moments, her tone serious. I think we need to check his ears. There's something strange about his reaction. A dog doesn't behave this way just because he's scared. It's deeper. Rick frowned. What do you mean, deeper? Kara didn't answer right away. She simply reached for the puppy's ear and gently lifted it, examining the small area just inside the fold. Rick's breath caught in his throat when she turned to him, her eyes wide. There's a tattoo, she said softly. A number right here. Rick felt a chill run through him. Tattoos were rare for pets, especially on puppies. But for military dogs or working dogs, it wasn't unheard of. This wasn't just a stray then. This was a dog with a past that had left him scarred, both physically and emotionally. Kara carefully jotted down the number and made a few calls to try and track its origin. Rick waited, his heart racing. The puppy, now dubbed River in Rick's mind, was still quiet, almost lifeless, lying on the table. His eyes, those soulful, deep eyes, stared off into nothing, as though he was still waiting for the worst to happen. It wasn't long before Kara returned with news that made Rick's blood run cold. The number traces back to a private training facility, she explained, her voice low. It's no longer in operation, but it used to train dogs for military and security purposes. And Rick, some of these dogs were treated poorly. There were reports of abuse, mental and physical. And some of them, the worst cases, were sold to underground fighting rings. Rick's stomach twisted in knots. His mind reeled. River hadn't just been abandoned. He'd escaped from something horrific, something that had tried to break him. Jesus, Rick muttered. No wonder he's so scared. Kara nodded solemnly. It explains a lot. He's not just traumatized from being abandoned. This dog has been through hell, and it's going to take time to heal him. But you're doing the right thing by taking him in. You might not see it now, but this pup is lucky you found him. Rick didn't say anything for a long moment. He wasn't sure he believed in luck, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let River down. No matter what had happened before, no matter how broken the dog was, Rick was going to help him heal. He had no other choice. As he looked at the puppy, Rick promised himself something he hadn't in years. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to leave River alone. Not now, not ever again. He picked the puppy up carefully and cradled him in his arms. "You're safe, buddy. You're safe now." But deep down, Rick knew the hardest part was still ahead. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance of quiet patience and unexpected breakthroughs. Rick didn't know how to heal a dog who had been broken by so much, but he tried every day. He tried in the way he spoke, in the way he fed River, in the way he watched over him every night. It wasn't much, but it was the only way he knew how to show the dog that he wasn't alone. At first, River didn't move much. He stayed curled up under Rick's workbench, rarely leaving his little corner, his eyes always watchful, always alert. The fear was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, like a storm that could break at any moment. When Rick would walk by, River would raise his head slightly, just enough to keep his eyes locked on Rick's movements. But it wasn't the gaze of trust. It was the gaze of someone who was always ready to flee, always waiting for something to happen. He would flinch at the slightest noise, every movement making him tense as if he were waiting to be struck. Rick had learned to be quiet, to move slowly around the house. The last thing he wanted was to make River feel threatened. At night, he kept the lights dim, speaking in soft tones, as if the very air itself might spook the puppy. Every moment felt like a test, and every day Rick hoped for a small breakthrough, a tail wag, a soft whine, even just a nudge of trust. But those moments were few and far between. On the third week, after a long day of working around the property, Rick returned to find River sitting at the door, waiting for him. For a brief second, his heart skipped, thinking maybe, just maybe, the puppy had finally started to trust him. River's posture was different, less stiff, his ears slightly perked as if trying to sense something, and there was a faint glimmer in his eyes, though still filled with uncertainty. "Hey there, buddy," Rick said softly, crouching down in front of him. "You waiting for me?" The puppy didn't answer with the usual hesitation. He didn't turn away. For the first time since Rick had found him, River allowed himself to remain still, watching Rick closely, his eyes following every movement without fear. Rick's hand slowly reached out, not wanting to push too far, but feeling a strange spark of hope. When his hand was just inches from River's head, the puppy tensed. But this time, he didn't pull away. Instead, River just sat there, his head tilted slightly, eyes wide. He wasn't running, he wasn't hiding, but he was still on guard. His muscles were tense, coiled, as if waiting for Rick to prove himself. Rick paused. No words. No sudden movements. He just stayed there, inches away from the dog, letting the silence settle between them. And then it happened. River, after what felt like an eternity, leaned forward slightly. He nudged Rick's hand with his cold nose. It wasn't much, just a little nudge, but in that simple gesture, Rick knew it meant something profound. Something changed. Maybe it was trust, or maybe it was just the start of it. But for the first time, River allowed Rick to touch him without flinching, without pulling away. Rick's heart surged in his chest. He didn't reach out immediately, afraid that any sudden motion might shatter this fragile moment. Instead, he waited for the puppy to take the lead, which River did by nudging his hand again. This time, Rick stroked the dog's head, gently, cautiously. His heart swelled with emotion as he felt River's soft fur under his fingertips. It wasn't the kind of joy Rick had expected. It wasn't a quick, instantaneous fix, but it was something real, something solid. River was here. He wasn't running anymore. For the next few days, things slowly began to improve. River still kept his distance, but there was less tension in his movements. He didn't hide as much under the workbench. Instead, he would follow Rick around the house, watching him work or lounging on the rug, his eyes softening just a little bit more each time. Sometimes, River would even approach Rick, sitting at his feet, his ears flicked forward in curiosity. Rick was careful not to push him too much. The last thing he wanted to do was undo the progress they had made. So, he kept their routine simple. Feeding River at the same time every day, taking him on slow, quiet walks around the property. At first, River wasn't too sure about the walks, barely moving from the porch. But slowly, Rick got him used to it, one small step at a time. One morning, while they were walking near the edge of the property, something unexpected happened. Rick was checking the fence for loose boards when he heard it, a soft whimper behind him. He turned, and there was River, standing near the tree line, his eyes wide, his body frozen in place. Rick's heart skipped a beat. He rushed over to him, concerned, his voice low and soothing. "River? What's wrong, boy?" But River didn't answer with fear this time. Instead, he turned, his body still tense, but his eyes were focused on something in the distance. Rick followed his gaze. There, at the far end of the yard, near the trees, a rabbit darted out from the bushes. River's tail twitched slightly, his body coiling like a spring. The instinct was there, the same one Rick had seen when he first spotted the dog, the same instinct that told him River could still be the strong, alert dog he was meant to be. Before Rick could even register what was happening, River darted forward, chasing the rabbit with a burst of energy that left Rick breathless. It wasn't just a chase. It was pure joy. For the first time since Rick had found him, River wasn't running from something. He was running towards something, embracing the thrill of the moment, without hesitation, without fear. Rick stood there, watching in awe as River sprinted through the grass, his ears flapping, his body alive with a sense of freedom that Rick hadn't seen in him before. It was a small thing, just a chase, but it was everything. For the first time, River was acting like a puppy again, the kind of puppy Rick had imagined him to be when he first found him by the river. When River finally stopped, panting heavily, his sides heaving, Rick knelt down and held his hand out. River trotted back, tail still stiff, but this time he came with a sense of purpose. He didn't flinch as Rick petted his head, and for the first time, River allowed himself to lean into the touch. He was still cautious, still wary of the world around him, but something had changed. He was starting to trust. Slowly, but surely. And in that moment, Rick realized that the hardest part of healing wasn't going to be physical. It was going to be emotional. River had already proven he was strong enough to survive the worst. But could he ever truly heal? Could he ever learn to trust again? Rick didn't have the answers, but for the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the dog that was waiting to come out. The dog that had been buried under layers of pain, fear, and survival instinct. The dog who wasn't just broken, but capable of being whole again. River wasn't just surviving anymore. He was starting to live. And that was all Rick could hope for. As the days passed, Rick began to notice more subtle changes in River. The dog still didn't bark much, but his eyes were softer, less haunted. His movements, once stiff and cautious, had become smoother, more relaxed. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of hesitation, still times when River would suddenly freeze, staring at the corner of the room or the space outside the window, as if expecting something. But they were fewer and farther between. Rick could see it. River was learning that not all spaces were filled with danger. Not every sound was a threat. The quiet moments, the mornings when River would curl up beside him on the couch or the evenings when they sat together on the porch, those moments were becoming more frequent. It was as though River was slowly learning what it meant to be a dog again. A dog who didn't live in fear, who didn't have to wait for the next command or punishment. But the scars, both physical and emotional, weren't going to disappear overnight. Rick knew that. It would take time, maybe even years. But he was willing to wait, for however long it took. That night, after another long day of walking around the property, Rick sat on the porch steps, staring at the stars. The air had cooled down, and there was a quiet stillness to the world around him. River lay beside him, his head resting on Rick's foot, his body at ease in a way that made Rick's heart swell with quiet pride. "You doing okay, buddy?" Rick whispered, his fingers brushing through the dog's thick fur. River didn't answer, of course. But he didn't need to. His presence was enough. For the first time since Rick had found him, River wasn't just surviving. He was living, and that was more than Rick could have ever hoped for. The days grew warmer, the winter's grip loosening, and with each new morning came new challenges, but also new victories. River had started to wag his tail, though it was still an awkward, tentative movement, like he was unsure of the act itself. But it was a sign that the walls he'd built around himself were slowly beginning to crumble. Rick's daily routine had shifted as well. He found himself looking forward to their morning walks, to the quiet moments of companionship they shared. The walks had become longer, the paths they took more adventurous. They'd even gone down to the river again, the very river where River had nearly drowned. But this time, River didn't hesitate at the edge. He walked beside Rick, sniffing at the water, even stepping closer, as if to say, "I'm not afraid anymore." Rick had always been a man of few words. He wasn't the type to open up easily, to talk about his feelings. But he found himself speaking more now, talking to River like he was the only one who truly understood him. He told the dog stories, stories about his past, about the things he'd lost, the regrets he carried. He talked about his childhood, about his old dog, Max, the one who had always been there for him, and how he'd never quite realized how much he missed that companionship until River showed up. And River listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. He just listened, his eyes soft and understanding, as if he knew everything Rick was saying. Maybe he did. One afternoon, after a particularly long walk, Rick returned to the house to find River sitting near the door, watching him with that quiet intensity that had become so familiar. For a moment, it almost felt like the dog was waiting for something. And then Rick realized it was waiting for him to come inside first. River was no longer just following him. He was waiting for permission. It was a small thing, but to Rick, it meant everything. That night, as Rick sat in his chair by the fireplace, River curled up on the rug, Rick couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer. That somehow, despite everything, they were finding their way to each other. But the past had a way of creeping up when you least expected it. It always seemed to find a way back, even when you thought you were safe. The phone call came in the middle of the night. Rick had just settled into bed, River asleep beside him, when the phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached over and picked it up, blinking at the unfamiliar number on the screen. His gut twisted. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him it wasn't good. He answered, his voice still thick with sleep. "Hello." A cold, familiar voice replied. "Rick, I told you I'd be back." It was the man from the black SUV. Rick's heart sank. "What do you want?" "I want what's mine," the man said, his voice calm, but there was a coldness in it that made Rick's skin crawl. "You've had your fun, but it's time to return what you took." Rick's grip tightened around the phone. "I didn't take anything. I found a dog. He was half dead. You're not getting him back." There was a silence on the other end, then a low chuckle. "You don't understand, do you? That dog isn't just a dog. He's a tool, a weapon. And you've made the mistake of thinking he's your pet." Rick's stomach churned. The man's words were like ice, cutting straight through him. But Rick wasn't going to back down now. Not after everything they had been through. "I'm not giving him back," Rick said firmly. "You come here, and we'll see who gets him." The man didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was laced with venom. "You don't know what you're messing with, Rick. I'll make you regret this." Rick's pulse quickened, but he didn't flinch. "You'll have to come through me first. And you won't get very far." The line went dead. Rick sat in the darkness, staring at the phone, his thoughts racing. The last few months had been about healing, about building something new with River. He had started to believe that they could be safe, that they could leave the past behind. But the past wasn't done with them. Not yet. He glanced down at River, still asleep beside the fireplace. The dog's breathing was steady, his body relaxed, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Rick's hand rested lightly on the dog's back, a silent promise. He wasn't going to let anyone take River. Not now. Not ever. River had earned his peace. And Rick would do whatever it took to protect it. The next few days were filled with tension. The man in the black SUV hadn't called again, but Rick couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Every sound outside made him jump. Every shadow seemed too sharp, too deliberate. River, too, seemed to sense it. He'd become more restless at night, pacing around the house, his ears twitching at every small noise. It was as though the calm they'd finally found was just a fragile veneer, barely holding on. Rick had done everything he could think of to fortify the house. The locks on the doors were reinforced. Every window had extra bars or shutters. He'd even set up a few traps in the yard, nothing too extreme, just enough to give him a warning. But deep down, Rick knew that wasn't enough. The man in the black SUV wasn't just coming for River. He was coming for a fight. But Rick wasn't going to let him win. It was early one morning, before the sun had risen, when it happened. Rick had been lying in bed, barely able to sleep, his mind still racing with thoughts of what could happen next. River lay curled at his feet, as usual. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards, the distant rustle of leaves outside. And then there was a noise. A low, steady thump. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Rick's heart slammed in his chest as he listened, straining to hear. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was outside. Rick moved slowly, careful not to wake River, and reached for the rifle by the bedside. His fingers trembled slightly as he grabbed it, but his grip tightened as soon as the weight of it settled in his hands. He stood and moved quietly toward the window, peering through the blinds. Two black SUVs were parked on the gravel road again. Only this time, there were more people. Three men, all dressed in dark clothes, stepped out of the vehicles, moving with purpose. The lead man, the same one from before, stood at the front, his face hard, his eyes cold. Rick's blood ran cold. It was happening. They were here. River stirred beside him, his ears alert. Rick held up a hand, signaling him to stay quiet. The dog's eyes met his, filled with understanding. River knew. He knew that the danger had returned. Rick crept back to the front door, making sure to be as silent as possible. He unlocked it slowly, his breath shallow, his thoughts racing. He was ready for this. Ready to defend his home, his dog, his peace. But he wasn't sure what kind of battle they were about to face. The men were walking toward the porch now, their footsteps heavy on the gravel. Rick didn't hesitate. He opened the door wide, stepping onto the porch to meet them. The lead man turned toward him, a smirk on his lips. "I told you, Rick. It's time to give him back." Rick's voice was steady, unwavering. "I told you. He's not yours anymore." The man's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being defied, Rick could tell. The others with him took a step forward, but Rick didn't budge. He stood his ground, his rifle at the ready, though he hadn't raised it yet. He wasn't here to make a fight, but he was prepared to finish it if it came to that. "We've been patient," the man said, his voice cold. "But that's running out. River belongs with us." Rick shook his head. He doesn't belong to anyone but himself now. You can't own him. The man's face twisted in anger. "You're making a mistake, Rick. You don't know who you're messing with." Rick didn't flinch. "I know exactly who you are. And I know exactly who I'm protecting." The man's jaw clenched, but before he could say anything else, there was a sound from behind him. A low growl. Rick didn't even need to turn around. He knew it was River. The dog stood at the doorway, his body rigid, his fur bristling. His eyes locked on the men, and for the first time, Rick saw something he hadn't seen in him before. Confidence. River wasn't hiding. He wasn't cowering. He was standing tall, ready to defend his home. "River," Rick whispered, his voice soft but firm. The dog's growl deepened, his stance unshakable. The lead man's eyes flicked to River, then back to Rick. "You think you can stop us? You think he's really yours?" "He's just a broken weapon, Rick. A tool that was trained to kill. Nothing more." Rick's heart pounded in his chest, but his voice didn't shake. "He's not a tool. He's a living, breathing creature. He's my family." The man took a step forward, then another, but River didn't flinch. The dog moved with quiet grace, stepping into Rick's shadow. The bond between them was palpable, a silent promise between them. No one would take River again. The man reached for the gun at his side, but before he could pull it out, River lunged. It happened so fast Rick barely had time to react. River was on the man in an instant, his teeth bared, his growl deafening. It wasn't a full-on attack, but it was enough to make the man freeze, his hand jerking back. Rick stepped forward, his rifle raised. "I said, get off my property." The man hesitated, clearly weighing his options. But he didn't back down. Instead, He reached for his weapon again. This time, he didn't stop. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. In one swift motion, Rick aimed and fired, the shot ringing out into the early morning air. It wasn't a kill shot. It didn't need to be. But it was enough to make the men stop. The sound echoed through the trees, a warning that couldn't be ignored. The men froze. The man with the gun slowly lowered his weapon. His face was pale, his hands still trembling from the close call. The others took a step back, their hands raised. "You don't own him," Rick said again, his voice colder than the wind. "Not anymore. And if you think you can take him from me, you're making a big mistake." There was a long, tense silence. The man seemed to be considering something, but in the end, he just nodded. "We'll be back," he said, his voice a whisper of threat. Then, without another word, he turned and motioned for his men to follow. They retreated toward their SUVs, but not before casting one last, lingering glance at River. The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. As the SUVs disappeared down the gravel road, Rick let out a long breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He lowered the rifle, his hands shaking. River stepped closer to him, his head resting against Rick's leg. "You're safe now," Rick whispered, stroking the dog's fur. For the first time in months, Rick felt a weight lift off his chest. It wasn't over, not entirely. But River was safe. For now. And that was enough. The door closed behind them, the world outside silent once again. And inside, in the quiet of their home, Rick and River sat together, finally at peace. The silence that followed felt strange, as if the world itself was holding its breath. For the first time in a long while, Rick allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was truly over. The threat had passed, at least for now, but there was a lingering question that kept gnawing at him. What did it all mean? Why had River been targeted in the first place? Rick sat in the living room, his fingers lightly tracing the grain of the old wooden table. River lay at his feet, his eyes closed, his body relaxed for the first time in what seemed like forever. The dog's breathing was slow, steady, as if he too was letting go of the fear that had clung to him for so long. Rick had never been one to believe in signs, but it felt like the world had given him one when he found River, drowning and broken, in that cold, cruel river. Maybe, just maybe, their paths had crossed for a reason. And now, after everything they'd been through, he couldn't help but wonder if the real healing was only just beginning. Days passed, each one quieter than the last. With no sign of the men from the SUVs, Rick allowed himself to let his guard down, just a little. The constant vigilance that had defined the past few weeks began to fade, replaced with something new. Comfort. Familiarity. Peace. Rick started taking River out for longer walks, exploring the woods behind the house, letting the dog roam freely for the first time. River, once so hesitant and guarded, was learning to trust the world again. He chased squirrels, barked at the birds, even rolled around in the grass as if he had never known anything but joy. It was a transformation that Rick could hardly believe, but he saw it with his own eyes. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard, Rick sat on the porch swing, his feet propped up on the railing. River was by his side, his head resting on Rick's knee. They were quiet, together in a way that didn't need words. "You know," Rick said softly, breaking the silence, "I never thought I'd be the kind of person to care this much about a dog." He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head at the absurdity of it all. But it was the truth. River had become more than just a companion. He was a friend, a protector, a partner in this strange dance they called life. River lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of Rick's voice. His eyes, always so deep and soulful, locked with Rick's for a moment. And then, with a softness that made Rick's heart swell, River nudged his hand, asking for attention. Rick scratched behind his ears, and River let out a contented sigh. "You saved me, didn't you?" Rick whispered, more to himself than the dog. And in that moment, Rick realized that he had never been alone in this. The dog who had once been so broken, so terrified, had given him something no one else could, a chance to heal. A second chance at life, at love, at connection. But just as the sun set and the day came to an end, something tugged at Rick's thoughts. He had been waiting for this moment, the one where everything settled into place, where the past finally let go. But as the night deepened, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still unfinished. He had given River a home, a life without fear, but there were still scars, hidden ones, that remained. Rick sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked down at River, whose eyes were heavy with sleep, his body curled into a tight ball beside him. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," Rick murmured. "You're home now." But was River truly home? Was it enough for him to lie beside Rick on the porch, or was there something more, something deeper, that they both still needed to confront? Rick didn't have the answers, but as he sat there, watching the stars slowly blink to life in the sky above, he knew one thing. He would keep fighting for River, for as long as it took. The following week, the first real rain of the season came, and with it, a strange peace. River's fear of storms had always been one of the most visible signs of his trauma, but this time, something was different. As the rain poured down, filling the world with its heavy, rhythmic sound, River simply lay beside Rick on the couch, his head resting on his lap. Rick could feel the tension in the dog's body, but it was softer now. It wasn't the wild, uncontrollable panic that used to seize him during thunderstorms. It was as if River had found a quiet place inside himself, a place where he could finally rest, even in the storm. For Rick, the storm outside mirrored his own inner conflict. The past would always be a part of him, as it was with River. But maybe, just maybe, they were learning how to weather it together. That night, as Rick watched the rain fall in sheets, he made a decision. He wasn't just going to protect River from the dangers outside. He was going to help him face the past, to find a way to truly heal. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But it was the only way forward. "You ready for this, boy?" Rick whispered, his fingers lightly brushing River's fur. River didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The dog's presence was enough. Together, they had survived the storm. And together, they would face whatever came next. And so, as the rain continued to pour, Rick leaned back, allowing the comfort of the dog's warmth to ease his worries. The world outside was dark, but inside, Rick felt something shift, a deep, abiding sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, it felt like home. With River by his side, the future didn't seem so uncertain anymore. The storm would pass. The past might always linger. But they had each other. And that, Rick realized, was more than enough.